The heat was a physical thing, a solid wall of shimmering air that pressed down on May's silk traveling dress, making the fine fabric cling to her skin like a damp shroud. She had arrived on the midday train, a steel serpent disgorging her into a world made of dust and sweat and the hostile stares of men whose faces were burned to the color of old leather. The town of Salvation's End was a lie in two words. There was no salvation here, only a slow grinding end under a sun that seemed intent on scorching the very hope out of the air. She stood on the splintered planks of the station platform, a single small trunk at her feet, a painted bird in a cage of bone-white civilization against a canvas of raw, brutal ochre. Her instructions had been simple, translated onto a crisp sheet of paper by a man in a San Francisco office who had not met her eyes. She was to wait for Mr. Silas Kane, a merchant of repute. He would see to her accommodations. The paper had felt like a promise then, a fragile bridge from the world she had lost to a new one she might build. Now, under the oppressive weight of the sun and the town's collective gaze, the paper felt like a bill of sale. Hours bled into one another. The shadow of the water tower crept across the tracks, a slow, dark finger counting down the moments of her dwindling certainty. Mr. Kane did not appear. Men lingered, their eyes crawling over her, their whispers a low buzz like flies on carrion. She kept her back straight, her chin lifted, focusing on the distant hazy line where the bruised purple of the mountains met the bleached yellow of the sky. She was a statue carved from pride and fear, willing herself not to shatter. Inside, a storm of anxieties raged. Her husband, a good man, a scholar, had died with a book in his hands and a gentle apology on his lips for leaving her so unprepared. His debts, however, were not so gentle. They were a pack of wolves that had hounded her across an ocean, pushing her into this arrangement, this desperate gamble on the word of a stranger in a land that did not want her. She clutched the small, smooth wooden bird hidden in her sleeve, a carving her father had made for her as a child. It was a tangible piece of a life that felt more like a dream with every passing second. The wood was a cool, solid anchor in the churning sea of her uncertainty. She was not just a widow, a debtor, a piece of exotic cargo. She was May, daughter of General Lin, and she would not break. Not here, not in front of these vultures. Just as the sun began its slow bleeding descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and crimson, a man separated himself from the landscape. He did not come from the town saloon or the general store. He rode in from the vast emptiness, a lone figure on a tall, dust-colored horse. He was not Mr. Kane. This man was hewn from the land itself, all sharp angles and sun-cured silence. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that seemed to hold no expression at all, a mask of weary competence. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life where wasted energy was a form of suicide. He dismounted, his boots making no sound in the thick dust, and his gaze swept over the platform, dismissing the loiterers before it settled on her. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were not leering or curious. They were assessing, like a man checking the sky for rain or the ground for tracks. It was a look that stripped her down to her essential purpose, and she did not yet know what that purpose was. He stopped a few feet from her, the space between them charged with a tension thicker than the heat. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had expected, and smelled of horse, leather, and the clean metallic scent of the dry earth. He held up a folded piece of paper, not the letter she carried, but a heavier document, creased and official. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "You are the woman from the East." It was not a question so much as a confirmation of a grim fact. She gave a single sharp nod, her throat too tight for words. He unfolded the paper. It was a deed of some kind, covered in spidery script. He did not offer it to her. He simply stated the truth with the finality of a nail being driven into a coffin. "Silas Kane is dead. Gambler's dispute. His debts fell to me." He gestured vaguely at the document. This included. May felt the platform sway beneath her feet. The world narrowed to the stark, unreadable face of this man and the crushing weight of his words. Not a marriage arrangement, not a position as a governess or a companion, a debt. She was chattel, a line item on a dead man's ledger. The silence stretched, broken only by the lazy hum of a fly and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The man watched her, his expression unchanging, waiting. He expected tears, she supposed, hysterics, a woman's frantic pleading. She gave him none of it. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting the hot, dusty air fill her lungs and burn away the initial shock, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. She had survived the death of her family, a war that tore her homeland apart, and a perilous journey across the world's largest ocean. She would survive this. She met his gaze, her own eyes dark and unyielding. My trunk, she said, her voice a quiet thread of steel. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect, passed through his wintry eyes before being extinguished. He gave a curt nod, hoisted her trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and turned. Wagon has a broken wheel. You will ride. He led the way to his horse, a powerful beast that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. There was no offer of help, no concession to her fine dress or her presumed delicacy. It was another test, a practical problem laid at her feet. She could protest, revealing a weakness he already suspected, or she could adapt. Without a word, she gathered the silk of her dress, found a foothold, and pulled herself up onto the horse's broad back, settling behind the worn leather of the saddle. Her movements were fluid, practiced, born of a childhood spent on horseback in the grassy plains of her homeland. The man, Elias Thorne, as she would later learn his name was, watched her in the reflection of the general store's window. He said nothing, but the set of his shoulders seemed to change, losing a fraction of their rigid tension. He swung himself into the saddle, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the horse forward, leaving the gawking town of Salvation's End to its dust and its whispers. The town vanished behind them, swallowed by the immense rolling plains. The oppressive noise of civilization, the gossip, the hammering, the drunken shouts, was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a living entity. There was only the rhythmic plod of the horse's hooves, the sigh of the wind through the dry grass, and the creak of leather. The landscape was a terrifying masterpiece of desolation. It was vast and empty, stretching to a horizon that seemed to recede with every step they took. The sun, now low and red, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. The world was stripped down to its essential elements, earth and sky, light and shadow, and the two silent figures moving through it. May felt an acute, dizzying sense of her own insignificance. She was a single speck of dust on an endless canvas, her personal tragedy, a meaningless whisper in the face of such ancient, indifferent grandeur. From her perch behind him, she observed the man. His back was a rigid wall, his posture unwavering. He rode not like a man traveling, but like a man patrolling the borders of his own solitude. His head was in constant, subtle motion, his eyes scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. He was reading the land, a text she could not comprehend. Every line of his body spoke of a deep, ingrained competence. He was a part of this harsh world, not a visitor to it. He belonged to the silence, to the vast, lonely distances. She saw the worn grip of the rifle in its scabbard, the handle of a knife tucked into his belt. He was a man prepared for violence, a man who lived with the constant expectation of it. And yet, she felt a strange, unwelcome seed of safety growing in the pit of her stomach. His silence was not menacing, it was functional. He was a shield, grim and unadorned, against a world far more dangerous than he was. Elias was acutely aware of the woman behind him. He could feel the light pressure of her hands on his coat, the subtle shift of her weight as she adjusted to the horse's gait. He had expected a different kind of burden. When he'd ridden to town to collect on Kane's final desperate wager, a deed to a plot of worthless land, he'd found himself the unwilling owner of a human being. The men at the saloon had laughed, telling him he'd finally gotten himself a woman, albeit a used foreign one. He'd met their jokes with a stony silence that had quickly curdled their amusement. He had no use for a woman. The part of him that knew what to do with softness and grace had been buried years ago with his wife Sarah in the cold ground behind his cabin. This woman, with her porcelain skin and her silk dress, was an aberration, a complication he did not need. He had expected her to weep, to bargain, to faint. He had been prepared for noise and fragility. He received neither. He felt her stillness, her straight-backed endurance, and it unnerved him. She did not complain about the dust, the uncomfortable ride, the grim reality of her situation. She simply endured. It was a language he understood better than words. As dusk deepened, Turning the world to shades of gray and indigo, he reined in the horse near a small, gurgling spring trickling from a rock formation. He swung down and, without a word, untied a canteen from his saddle. He filled it, took a long drink, and then held it up to her. It was not a gesture of gallantry, it was a practical necessity. But it was the first offering, the first crack in the wall of their shared isolation. May reached down, her small, slender fingers brushing against his calloused ones as she took the canteen. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of awareness through both of them. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. She handed it back, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment in the fading light. Zizi, she whispered, the word a foreign ghost on the wind. He did not understand it, but he understood the gratitude in her tone. He simply nodded, capped the canteen, and remounted. The journey continued in silence, but something had shifted. The space between them now held not just tension, but a shared drink of water, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual existence in this vast and unforgiving world. They arrived at the homestead well after dark, under a canopy of stars so bright and dense they seemed to tear holes in the fabric of the night. The place was a monument to solitude. A single small cabin stood silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, its windows dark and vacant like the eyes of a skull. A short distance away stood a smaller, rougher structure, perhaps a workshop or a storage shed. A corral held a lone horse, which nickered softly at their approach. There were no other lights, no other signs of life for what felt like 100 miles in every direction. May's heart, which had been a cold, hard knot in her chest, sank even further. This was not just isolation, it was an erasure from the world. Elias dismounted and helped her down, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist. He lifted her trunk from the horse, and then, to her surprise, he did not lead her to the main cabin. He walked toward the smaller secondary building. He pushed the door open, and a warm, welcoming light spilled out. Inside, a fire was already crackling in a small stone hearth. A clean cot was made up in the corner, a thick wool blanket folded neatly at its foot. A wooden bucket filled with fresh water sat on a small crate, a dipper resting beside it. He had prepared this place for her. He had anticipated her arrival and created a space that was separate, private. He set her trunk down on the floor. Then he turned and pointed to the inside of the door. A heavy wooden bar rested in iron brackets, a lock for the inside. The gesture was as loud and clear as a shout. It said, "You are not my prisoner. You are not my property to be used. You are safe from me." It was an act of profound, unspoken honor from a man who had every legal right in this lawless land to treat her as anything but. A wave of relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over May. The fear she had carried of this man, this silent, grim captor, finally receded, replaced by a complex and unsettling gratitude. He looked at her one last time, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering firelight. He gave a single curt nod, then turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. May slid the heavy wooden bar into place. The solid thud echoed in the small cabin, the sound of a cage door closing. But for the first time, she felt like she was the one holding the key. The days that followed fell into a silent, monastic rhythm. A pattern of provision emerged, as predictable as the rising of the sun. Each morning, before the first gray light touched the sky, she would hear the soft crunch of his boots outside her door. When she opened it, she would find a small offering on the porch step, a pail of fresh milk still warm from the cow, a few eggs nestled in a bed of straw, a stack of freshly chopped firewood. He provided for her needs completely, but he never intruded on her space. He was a ghost, a caretaker she saw only from a distance. From the single small window of her cabin, she watched him. Her initial fear, which had softened into gratitude, now evolved into a quiet, analytical observation. She watched him work from dawn until dusk, with a relentless, punishing energy, as if he were trying to physically exhaust the ghost that haunted him. He moved with a purpose that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. She saw him mend a fence with the patient, meticulous hands of a surgeon. She saw him speak to his horse in a low, gentle murmur that was softer than any tone he had used with her. And sometimes in the evenings, she would see him stand by a small, unmarked mound of stones behind the main cabin, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped with a grief so immense It seemed to suck the very air from around him. She began to understand that his silence was not a rejection of her, but a fortress he had built around a wound that would not heal. He was not her captor. He was a fellow prisoner, chained to his own patch of desolate land by a memory. May refused to let this enforced idleness erode her spirit. She was not a pet to be fed and housed. She was a survivor. She began to reclaim her agency in small, quiet ways. She scrubbed her little cabin until the wooden floor shone. She organized her few belongings in her trunk with military precision. And then she found her rebellion. Using the small, sharp knife she had kept hidden in the lining of her dress, she began to carve. She found a piece of discarded firewood, its grain smooth and pale. Hour after hour, she sat by her small fire, the knife an extension of her hand, her mind focused, the world shrinking to the piece of wood she held. The act of creation was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that even here, in this empty corner of the world, she could still make something beautiful. She was not just an object defined by her circumstances. She was a creator, a person with a history and a skill that belonged only to her. She carved a hawk, its wings swept back, its eyes fierce and intelligent. It was a creature of the sky, a symbol of freedom and sharp-sighted survival. It was everything she aspired to be. One morning, after she had collected the milk he'd left, she placed the small wooden hawk on the porch step, where the pail had been. It was not a payment. It was not a gift of supplication. It was a message, an offering from one solitary soul to another. It said, I see the hawk in you. See the hawk in me. It was a bridge across the chasm of their silence, built not with words, but with wood and skill, and a shared understanding of what it meant to endure. She did not know how he would receive it or if he would understand its meaning. But for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she felt she had a voice. Elias found the hawk when he came to collect the empty milk pail. He stopped, his hand hovering over the wood. He picked it up, his rough, calloused fingers tracing the impossibly delicate lines of the feathers, the sharp curve of the beak. It was perfect. It was alive. He had seen 1,000 hawks ride the thermals over his land, and the spirit of every one of them was captured in this small piece of wood. It was a thing of grace and ferocity, a thing of beauty in a world that had long been stripped of it. He looked toward her cabin, its window dark, and felt a profound and unsettling shift within him. This woman was not what he had thought. She was not a fragile doll to be protected or a burden to be managed. She possessed a quiet strength, a hidden core of artistry and will that he had not anticipated. The carving was not just a gift, it was a mirror. That evening, he did something he hadn't planned. He took the deed from the locked box where he kept his few important papers, the deed to his land, his parents' wedding certificate, Sarah's death certificate. He walked across the cold, hard-packed earth to her cabin. He did not knock. He built a small, clean fire a few feet from her door. The flare of the match was unnaturally loud in the stillness. He waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, and she stood there, silhouetted in the warm light from her hearth, a wary expression on her face. He met her eyes across the dancing flames. He held up the deed, the paper that declared her his property. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into a cascade of glowing embers that floated up into the night sky and vanished. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the dying flames. You are not property, he said, his voice raw. You are free. When the snows melt, the road east will be clear. You can leave. He paused, the weight of the next words heavy in the air. But winter is coming. The passes will be closed within the month. It is not safe to travel. He had burned the contract. He had given her back her name. But he had also acknowledged the reality of their shared prison. Her continued presence was no longer his decree. It was her choice, dictated by the unforgiving logic of the seasons. He turned and walked back to his own dark, empty house, leaving her with the ashes of her bondage and the cold, terrifying gift of freedom. The first snows came a week later, not as a gentle dusting, but as a furious, wind-whipped blizzard that descended from the mountains like an invading army. The world beyond the homestead was erased, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. The cold was a physical predator, seeping through the chinks in the logs, its icy teeth biting at any exposed skin. The separation between their two small cabins, once a symbol of honor and respect, now became a life-threatening liability. The path between them became a treacherous landscape of deep drifts and blinding snow. It was on the second day of the storm that Elias knew he had to act. He fought his way through the tempest, the wind tearing at him, to her cabin. When she opened the door, a blast of snow and icy air filled the small room. He didn't waste words. "You cannot stay here. The fire will not be enough. You will come to the house." It was a command, born of grim necessity. The time for separate spaces was over. Survival demanded proximity. She looked at him, her face pale in the gloom, and simply nodded. She gathered a small bundle of her things, and he led her through the blinding storm to the main cabin, the sanctuary of his long and lonely grief. The arrival of an external threat came not on the wind, but on horseback. 3 days into the blizzard, when the world was a muffled, white silence, Elias saw them. Three figures, dark shapes against the snow, moving slowly, deliberately toward the homestead. He recognized one of them instantly, Silas Kane. The news of his death had been a lie, a saloon rumor, or perhaps Kane had been tougher than the gambler who shot him. The other two men were strangers, hard-faced and carrying rifles with a casual ease that spoke of their profession. They were railroad men, enforcers by the look of them, the kind of men who cleared squatters from the land with fire and lead. Kane had come back for his property. "Get down," Elias said, his voice a low growl. May, who had been looking out the window, dropped to the floor without question. The fragile peace of their coexistence was shattered. The cabin, once his fortress of solitude, was now a besieged outpost. He pulled his rifle from the pegs on the wall, his movements economical and sure. He checked the load, his knuckles white. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered. He moved to the side of the main window, peering through a small gap in the crude curtain. Kane and his men had stopped at the edge of the clearing, using the trees as cover. They were not fools. "Thorn!" Kane's voice was thin and reedy, carried on the wind. "I know you're in there, and I know you have what's mine. Send out the China doll, and we'll let you keep your miserable patch of dirt." Elias's jaw tightened. The casual, dehumanizing way Kane spoke of her ignited a cold, protective fury in him. He had burned the deed. She was not property, not his, and certainly not Kane's. He lifted his rifle, resting the barrel on the window frame. His first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the tree trunk, a foot from Kane's head. The crack of the rifle was a definitive answer. A splinter of bark exploded from the tree. The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin, one shattering the remaining glass in the window, spraying the room with shards and a blast of frigid air. The siege had begun. The battle was a deadly calculus of angles and timing. Elias was a superb marksman, and the cabin offered good cover, but he was one man against three. He could not be in two places at once. As he exchanged fire with the two gunmen, pinning them down, he was terrifyingly aware that Kane was using the opportunity to circle around the cabin, seeking a blind spot, a way to flank him. He was trapped. He fired, ducked as bullets splintered the wood near his head, and fired again. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cold, clean scent of the snow. It was then that he heard a movement behind him. He turned, his heart lurching, thinking one of them had somehow gotten inside. It was May. She was holding his other rifle, the heavy Winchester he kept cleaned and oiled but hadn't used since Sarah's death. He opened his mouth to tell her to get down, to hide, that she would only get herself killed. But the words died in his throat. The way she held the weapon was not the awkward, clumsy grip of a novice. She held it with a firm, practiced confidence, her body balanced, her movements spare and precise. Her face, which he had only ever seen as a mask of quiet endurance, was now transformed. It was calm, focused, and utterly lethal. She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the far side of the cabin, the side he could not watch. She moved to the small, grimy window there, staying low, using the wall as cover. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for instructions. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, fitting the stock to her body as if it were a custom-made extension of her own arm. She sighted down the barrel, her breathing slow and controlled. Elias watched, stunned into silence, as a new reality unfolded before him. This was not the delicate woman from the east. This was a soldier. He saw a flicker of movement outside, the shadow of Kane trying to sneak toward the back of the cabin. Before he could even shout a warning, the Winchester in May's hands roared. The recoil barely moved her. Outside, Silas Kane screamed, a sharp, ugly sound that was cut short. Elias risked a glance. Kane was on the ground, clutching a leg that was bleeding profusely into the pure white snow. It was a perfect shot, disabling, but not immediately fatal. It had been deliberate. The other two gunmen, startled by the shot from an unexpected quarter, broke cover, firing wildly at both windows now. In that moment, the dynamic of the fight shifted. They were no longer one man against three. They were a team. Elias no longer had to worry about his flank. He focused his fire on one of the gunmen, who was reloading behind a large pine. May fired again, her shot kicking up snow near the second gunman's feet, forcing him back, preventing him from getting a clean shot at Elias. They moved in an unspoken rhythm, a deadly dance of cover and fire. He would draw their attention, and she would take the tactical shot. She anticipated his movements, and he learned to trust her aim. The silence that had defined their relationship for months was replaced by the deafening language of combat, and in it, they communicated more perfectly than they ever had with words. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun, pinned down, with one of their own wounded and bleeding, and now facing two competent shooters instead of one. The gunmen's resolve broke. They dragged the screaming Kane back to their horses and fled into the swirling snow, leaving trails of blood to mark their retreat. Silence descended once more, heavy and ringing in the aftermath of the violence. The cabin was a wreck. The air was thick with smoke. Elias leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, a burning graze along his ribs where a bullet had torn through his shirt. He looked at May. She was standing in the middle of the room, the heavy rifle held loosely at her side. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, profound sadness. He finally found his voice, a rough, incredulous whisper. How? She looked down at the rifle, then back at him. My father was a general, she said softly. He believed his daughters should know how to protect his home as well as his sons. The simple statement explained everything and nothing. It spoke of a life, a world, a history he could not possibly imagine. The wall of his assumptions about her, about who and what she was, had been completely demolished. In the quiet that followed, with the adrenaline fading and the cold seeping back in, a different kind of wall crumbled. He looked around the damaged room, at the splintered wood and shattered glass. It looked hauntingly familiar. He sank onto a stool, the pain in his side a dull, insistent throb. My wife, he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He hadn't spoken her name to another living soul in 5 years. Sarah, she died in this house. Raiders. I wasn't fast enough. He didn't know why he said it. Perhaps it was the shared violence, the scent of gunpowder that dredged up the memory, or perhaps it was something in May's eyes, a calm understanding of loss that invited the confession. He had confessed his greatest failure, the source of his all-consuming guilt, to the one person who had just saved him from repeating it. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply came over, took a clean rag from a drawer, and began to gently clean the wound on his side. Her touch was firm and steady. It was the touch of a healer, a partner, a survivor. It was a touch that acknowledged his pain without judgment. And in that quiet, vulnerable moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, something new and fragile began to build between them. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was absolute, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The bodies of the men they had been forced to kill during the final, desperate charge were gone, covered by the snow, the earth granting them a clean, cold burial. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional landscape of the homestead had been irrevocably altered. The siege had shattered the physical and emotional distance between them, and in its place, a raw, fragile intimacy remained. May did not return to her small cabin. The question was never asked, the decision was never spoken. It was simply a fact, as solid and self-evident as the snow on the ground. Her place was in the main house now. The small outbuilding, once her sanctuary and her prison, became just a storage shed again. Their two separate, solitary lives had been forged by violence into a single, shared existence. The house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. For years it had been a mausoleum, a hollow space inhabited by one man and the ghost of his grief. Now it began to feel like a home. A new language developed between them, one built on the quiet bedrock of shared tasks and mutual reliance. The sparse utilitarian dialogue of their first weeks was gone, replaced by a comfortable silence that needed no words. He taught her how to read the tracks of animals in the snow, how to set a snare, how to tell by the feel of the air if more weather was coming. His instructions were brief, his hands guiding hers as he showed her how to properly sharpen an axe or skin a rabbit. In return, she brought a quiet order to the chaos of his life. She mended the tears in his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned to cook on the wood stove, turning their meager supplies of flour, salted meat, and dried beans into savory, nourishing meals that filled the cabin with aromas it hadn't known in years. She did not clean away the memory of his wife. She simply made space for a new life to grow alongside it. One afternoon, he returned from checking the trap lines to find her carving by the fire. He watched her for a moment, the way her hands moved with such grace and precision, transforming a block of wood into something vital. He left without a word and returned a few minutes later from his workshop. He placed a large, smooth block of pale, fine-grained basswood on the table beside her. It was the best carving wood he had, saved from a tree that had fallen years ago, hoarded for a project he never began. He said nothing. He just offered the wood. Her eyes lifted to his, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was a hesitant, fragile thing, but it lit her face like the first light of dawn. The days shortened, and the winter deepened its hold on the land. Their life became a simple, repetitive dance of survival, chopping wood, hunting, preserving food, maintaining the cabin against the relentless cold. They worked together, a seamless, efficient team. The memory of the gunfight faded, but its legacy remained. He no longer saw her as someone to be protected, but as an equal, a partner whose skills and resilience matched his own. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her movements in the cabin, the quiet hum as she worked, the scratch of her carving knife on wood. These small sounds were the new pulse of his home, a rhythm that pushed back against the suffocating silence of his grief. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of pine smoke and the stew she had made for dinner. She was polishing her latest carving, a magnificent wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. He was cleaning his rifle, the familiar methodical task a comfort in its repetition. The silence between them was warm and deep, a shared space of contentment. He finished his work, resting the rifle back on its pegs. He looked around the room at the neatly stacked firewood, the clean swept floor, the mended curtain on the window. He looked at her, her dark hair catching the firelight, her face serene and focused. The words came to him unbidden, spoken in a low voice that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. "This place," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It feels like a home again." It was the simplest of statements, yet it held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken sorrow and a future of unexamined hope. It was an admission of how profoundly she had changed him, of how her quiet strength had chased the ghosts from the corners of his house and his heart. It was the closest he could come to a declaration. May stopped her polishing. She did not look at him, but he saw her hands still on the wooden wolf. A long moment passed, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind. Then she placed the carving on the mantelpiece, next to a faded tintype photograph of a smiling young woman with his eyes. The wolf and the memory, the survivor and the ghost, side by side. She turned to him, her dark eyes luminous in the firelight, and in their depths, he saw not just gratitude or respect, but the quiet, steady promise of a spring yet to come. The walls were finally, completely gone.